Para cantar la bamba se necesita una poca de gracia, una poca de gracia y otra cosita. Allá arriba, y arriba, allá arriba, y arriba, y arriba. Y yo no soy marinero, yo no soy marinero, por ti seré, por ti seré, por ti seré.
Aunque soy chiquitito, de inspiración, te me canto la bamba. Indio Verde, me canto la bamba de corazón, que tilín, que tilín, que tilín, que tilín, que tilín, tilín, que repique campana. ¿De dónde? Que repique campana de Medellín, de Medellín, de Medellín.
Qué bonita es la bamba, qué bonita es la bamba en la madrugada cuando todos la bailan. Cuando todos la bailan en la ramada y arriba y arriba. Y arriba y arriba y arriba iré, yo no soy marinero. Yo no soy marinero, por ti seré, por ti seré, por ti seré.
A la mar que te vayas, a la mar que te vayas, iré contigo para ver cómo vences, para ver cómo vences al enemigo. Allá arriba, allá arriba, allá arriba, allá arriba, allá arriba. Era, yo no soy marinero, yo no soy marinero, soy capitán, soy capitán, soy capitán. Que se acabe la bamba, que se acabe la bamba y vengo otro son, allá arriba y arriba, allá arriba y arriba y arriba iré. Yo no soy marinero, yo no soy marinero, por ti seré, por ti seré, por ti seré.
Tierra de luz, tan bella como no hay dos, en mi lindo Veracruz, tierra bendita de Dios. En todita la región se oyen alegres cantar y se compra con el sol entre arrullos del palmar. Yo le canto con amor
a mi tierra tropical.
Qué bonito es Veracruz,
nunca lo podré olvidar.
Cuando comienza el fandango, ya se empiezan a afinar, se arrancan con un guapango y se ponen a cantar. Allá por la madrugada, se toca por re menor, se oyen muy dulces tonadas inspiradas con amor. Yo le canto con amor
a mi tierra tropical.
Qué bonito es Veracruz,
nunca lo podré olvidar.
Y el violín, cantando con alegría, se pasan los trovadores toda la noche y el día, sin que falte la jarana para acompañar el son, música veracruzana que llevo en el corazón. Yo le canto con amor
a mi tierra tropical.
Qué bonito es Veracruz,
nunca lo podré olvidar.
Yo le canto con amor
a mi tierra tropical.
Qué bonito es Veracruz,
nunca lo podré olvidar.
Booking a family vacation in a Vrbo means leaving all the craziness behind. Well,
Okay. Can you hear me now? Very good. Okay. Good morning. Today, in my mind, I see people walking, finding, struggling, settling in hope, changing, shaping, in struggle, and in good times. Being music, being food, being dancing, being connected, being Mexico, being African, being. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our PCC Global Zoom room. And we are so glad to have you join us here on today as we are taking another bold step to foster knowledge, skills, and awareness in our ever globally diverse and multicultural world. I am Regina Garcia, chair of the PCC Multicultural Activities Committee, coordinator of PCC Global Programs, and an English professor. And on behalf of PCC Arts and Sciences, PCC Global, MAC, the Student Activities Committee, and our valued partners, AMEXCAN, we want to let you know that we are excited about what will happen here today. Today, we will learn more than perhaps we've ever known about the power and truth of cultural expansion, particularly as we look and learn more about the country of Mexico. Here today to introduce our presenter of the hour is Dr. Stephanie Manley-Rook, Dean of Arts and Sciences at Pitt Community College. Dr. Rook has many accolades. She is an alum of Howard University, Texas Women's University, and Louisiana State University. She is also an avid global professor, scholar, and traveler. Her many travels have connected and even reconnected her to a diversity of people imbued with the knowledge gained not only from what they've learned formally, but indeed from who they are. Therefore, we sit in anticipation this morning of who Dr. Rook will present today. However, before she comes, I encourage you to open your minds, still your preconceptions, and make sure as you have questions to put them in the chat. We will address them. Students, I also ask you to go on and type your names in the chat as well, as this will count for your attendance if that's required. Once our presenter's presentation is complete, Professor Emily McConnell and I will relay your questions to her for response. And again, we welcome you and we thank you for attending on this beautiful morning. Dr. Rook, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. Good morning to everyone, and thanks for joining our program today. Before I introduce Dr. Hammack, I just want to acknowledge the amazing work of several groups that allowed the two of us, Dr. Hammack and myself, to meet in Harlem, New York, on the very vibrant 125th Street on a hot summer day in August of last year. I was honored to be selected for the Fulbright-Hays Summer Seminar, which was organized by the Comexis Fulbright-Garcia Robles team from Mexico City. The incredible directors there, Renee Gonzalez de la Lama and Hazel Blackmore, brought a team of college professors, scholars, and administrators to Harlem for a pre-orientation workshop before we left the United States to study Afro-Mexican history and culture for the entire month of August, with stops in 8 Mexican cities. Dr. Hammack was one of our first presenters, and when I heard that she had very deep Greenville ties, I knew I wanted to help her come to PCC for a homecoming to present her research. In addition to all of the folks that Mrs. Garcia has acknowledged, I would like to express my gratitude to President Rouse, my boss, Vice President Dr. Tom Gould, our PCC Global Ed Committee, our Global Scholars faculty, Arts and Sciences Division department chairs, my assistant, and all of our PCC faculty joining us today. Our lecture today, Black American Freedom in Mexico, para salvar Su Familia de Esclavitud, to save one's family from slavery, is being presented by Dr. María Esther Hammack, an alumna of East Carolina University. She holds a BA in History, magna cum laude, and an MA in History in the Atlantic world, and her research explores the hidden history of slavery and freedom in 19th century United States and Mexico borderlands. Dr. Hammack received her PhD in US history with certified portfolios in African and African diaspora studies and women and gender studies from the University of Texas at Austin. She is a Mexican scholar and public historian whose work centers and connects through a gender lens the histories of liberation and abolition in North America and the Black diaspora in Mexico. She is currently revising her first monograph, Channels of Liberation, Black Freedom Across the US-Mexican Global South, a work that examines and recovers the transnational experiences of Black Americans, situated as freedom fighters who left the United States to claim and secure liberation in Mexican spaces. Since 2019, she has served as an editorial assistant of the Journal of African American History and serves as a representative of the American History Association's 2021 through 2024 Graduate and Early Career Committee. She is the 2021 through 2023 Barra Postdoctoral Fellow in the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. We are so glad to have you here, Dr. Hammack, and I will turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to be here and hopefully soon to be back in Greenville and be able to share a little bit of my work with all of you and all of the students at Pitt Community College. I do want to thank Pitt Community College and Professor Rook for inviting me and making this possible, but also for all the amazing work that you are doing with Fulbright and to recover these histories and bring them back to the students in Eastern North Carolina. So thank you so much for that and for bringing me here. I will begin by telling you a brief but powerful story of liberation that connects Mexico and the US, one that allows us to understand the deep and at times hard but foundational histories shared by both countries. Histories that truly shape both the US and Mexico in tandem, their borderlands, and importantly, their mutual relationships and understandings. Then I will offer you an overview of my work briefly, and broadly, and I will tell you a little bit about the geographic spaces I center in the work that I do. I will also tell you a little bit about Mexico's abolitionist process and offer a few narratives that I have reconstructed about the people that I study and whose lives I have been working hard to recover and to make it better known and to teach them. But before I start my story, I did want to point out to the map on the screen. And it is a map that I conceived, a visual for my own work when I was finishing my dissertation. It is by no means a finished map, but I hope that it offers you a great visual of some of the geographies that I will be discussing and presenting. I'm not a map maker, but this is what I created for myself as I was tracing people's experiences from as far as North Carolina and Virginia and how they reach spaces in different Mexican localities and spaces. And so I wanted to also point out to this other map to also give you another visual of how these geographies that I will be talking about have changed over time with, what we consider the US-Mexico borderlands or the US-Mexico border today wasn't so in the past. These border spaces, these geographies have changed according to whoever was governing, to politics and people changing it. So when we consider Mexican spaces, we have, for instance, places like Texas that up until 1836 was a Mexican space. And actually Mexico continued considering it a Mexican space up until its annexation to the US. And the places that we consider, for instance, southern Arizona was a Mexican space until the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. But actually the Mexican government, all authorities didn't actually leave to places like Tucson, Arizona until 1856. And of course, with the after the Mexican-American War, all the vast territory was ceded to the United States. But up until 1848 and 1848, 1850, it was still considered a Mexican space. There were, Mexican people, Mexican customs and cultures. And so I wanted to show you these visuals to give you an idea of the geographies and the spaces that I will be discussing in this presentation. And I hope these are very, very helpful. So I wanted to begin with the story of liberation. Throughout the 19th century, thousands of people enslaved across the United States resisted. And while many headed north to Canadian destinations to be free, others headed south. Some headed to the Caribbean as well, actually, some to places like Haiti, some went to Liberia, to African nations, some went to Sierra Leone. And thousands chose to go to Mexico as well. And so this story is about a couple who chose to go to Mexico to be free. In the spring of 1842, a Black woman was enslaved in the vicinity of Texana, Texas, in what is now Jackson County, Texas. For many years, she had lived with a Mexican man and together had been living as husband and wife in the region which lied about 20 miles northeast of Victoria, Texas. But that spring, this woman and her husband chose to fight for their freedom and abscond. And I'll sort of point out around where this is. So they were living around this area here in what was Texas. And they decided to, she was enslaved around this area, not too far from where Victoria, Texas was. So. Together, they planned their escape and detailed every trail, bend, and river they would encounter and need to cross on their journey to freedom. The Mexican man who had journeyed to the Texas borderlands years before, he knew that he knew the way they needed to go to reach Mexico. They knew it was a very dangerous journey, but freedom was worth every price, even the highest one. In the first week of June of 1842, they were ready. They took supplies, they took food, they took 2 horses and rode them southward, hoping to leave Texas behind and reach safe havens beyond the Mexican border. They made their way towards Mexican territory and they almost made it. But as they reached the Lavaca River, they were intercepted and pursued by a group of slave hunters, unscrupulous employees of a highly profitable profession, which was the institution of chattel enslavement. They were quickly surrounded. They were caught. The Mexican man was lynched on the spot. His body was returned to the place where the authorities claimed he had stolen his enslaved wife. His body was then hung, displayed as a public reminder and threat to all others in Texas and across the South for that matter, who hoped, braved, or even thought to run away or to help anyone run away. The Black woman was forcibly returned to her US enslaver. And I wanted to start with this story, not only because it is one that truly made an impression upon me as a historian, as a Mexican, as a human being, but because these are stories, the hard stories that we must not forget to tell, that we must not allow to be forgotten. We must never allow these stories to be erased from our history or from our memories. So when we talk about liberation in Mexico and discuss the role that Mexico had in the fight against the institution of slavery, it is imperative that we not only highlight the stories of success of those who made it to freedom and claimed freedom and became part of the Mexican nation, but it is important to also tell the story of those who failed to, who didn't make it, who were stopped, whose journeys were to freedom were denied. because, whose freedom were denied. Sorry, I lost my spot on there. So, and part of the work that I do is to tell both stories, the stories of those who made it and the stories who didn't make it, because this gives us an idea of not only who was fighting for freedom, but also offers us an opportunity to better understand what liberation meant and what freedom meant in both these borderlands, but in Mexican spaces, for people that actually made it to Mexico and for people that chose to not escape. They were still resisting. They were still freedom fighters. They were fighting for freedom and to be free, ultimately. And this is some of the sources that I have been able to find to recover the story of this Black woman and this Mexican man. Little is known about their experiences or about their lives, but he may have been a dead peonage and indentured somewhere along this plantation where this Black woman was held enslaved. There is documentation that they had been living as husband and wife for many years, and so until they decided to make it to freedom. And so my research, a little bit about my research in a nutshell, it reconceptualizes through a transnational and gender lens contemporary understandings of people who fought for freedom, people who I situate not as runaways or fugitives, but as freedom fighters. And I want to offer a little more about this idea of freedom fighters or freedom fighting. People who I don't situate them as runaways or fugitives, because that language, I believe language is very important, and that language was a language utilized and implemented and perpetuated by the same institution of slavery that conceived these laws and rules and chattel slavery. And so what I do is I try to situate these histories in a way that centers the individuals who were always seeking to be free. They were running away to be free, but also those that chose to not run away, they were also fighting in many ways, resisting every day of their lives because they desired freedom, and they understood their right to freedom, even when they're lost or the loss of the land did not offer them freedom. And so situating them as people who fought for freedom offers us a better lens to understand their experiences and their desire to move and cross vast frontiers in order to be free. My goal is also to help widen and reconsider the timeline, the geography, and the actors of liberation in North America and the Black diaspora in Mexico. My hope, my larger hope, is to help present and better understand how Black Americans journeyed south, how they escaped, how they survived, the spaces that they crossed, the people who offer them assistance, the connections, relationships forged with Mexicans, how mutual relations work, how they succeeded and they failed, those who led them, and how freedom or the levels of freedom they encountered in Mexico materialized for them. Importantly, I want to understand and to present how they were able to claim freedom and space and citizenship with the laws that Mexico had to offer. Importantly, however, and this is key to my work, it is to stress that, as much as I have been able to recover and understand through the records that I've been able to find in Mexico and the US, is that those who were leading freedom, the question is who was leading people to freedom? It were Black Americans, enslaved and free, I argue, who were engineering these channels of liberation to Mexican spaces themselves. They were very active in their pursuits of freedom at the many levels of this freedom materialized for them in Mexican spaces. And thousands made it to safe havens, such as this man, David Thomas, whose record I have put up here for you. And he argued, he said, when the Mexican authorities interviewed him and they asked him, why did you decide to come? He said, I'm leaving to save, not only, to save myself from a lifetime of enslavement, but really to save my family from a lifetime of enslavement. And so you do start seeing with the sources that I've been able to find, particularly in Mexico, the voices of these people that were leaving the United States, of Black Americans who had escaped and reached Mexico and had, passed through, connecting with the authorities. So David Thomas arrived in the frontier that was very close to Monclova in Coahuila. he went to the local alcalde and he said, hey, I would like to stay, but I also would like to have the protection of the authorities because I know the slave hunters can come in and kidnap me. And so people like David Thomas would ask for security. A lot of the times, like David Thomas actually decided not to stay on the borderlands because of fear of being kidnapped and re-enslaved. And so he, in his petition, he actually made it clear that he wanted to continue going south. It is not known where he went, but this record actually shows that the Mexican government offered him the protections that he was asking to save his family from a lifetime of enslavement. And so, and we learned these stories by, I've learned these stories by reconsidering and reading a lot of the records, not only in the US, but in Mexican spaces, and their voices have come through. And that's why I've been able to reconstruct some of their experiences. And now I want to highlight a little bit about why this mobility, why this freedom was possible in Mexican spaces. The long and but consistent process of abolition that brewed and shaped Mexico and liberation in Mexican spaces. Liberation, abolition, and anti-slavery initiatives were very much procured in Mexican spaces, even amidst all the frontier changes, and especially since independence in the 18 teens from Spanish control, since that was being sought for. As many of you know or may know, Mexico's independence from Spain was a long process that took over 10 years. But throughout this process, all the factions and leaders who came to power in the name of independence were very intentional about abolition, or the abolition of slavery in Mexico. Freedom was at the forefront for all Mexicans, Black, Native, and Mestizo alike. And in this slide, I've placed a few excerpts from various laws and decrees that had been issued since the 18 teens, as you see here, that showed Mexico's abolition process. Very slow to come, but very consistent. As early as 1810, for instance, right here. As early as 1810, Mexico sought to be rid of chattel slavery. For instance, on November, I'll talk about November 29th, 1810, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla issued the first decree that abolished slavery in Mexico. Hidalgo stated that, and I'm quoting his decree, that the selling of men was against the claims of nature, and therefore slavery and all laws pertaining to slave acquisition, trafficking, and commerce were abolished in the entire nation. In 1821 and 1822, for instance, 2 laws were passed that guaranteed citizenship to all people, including Mexicans of African descent. And before I go into these laws, I want to stress that while this process of independence from Spain was brewing between 1810 and 1821, people that were leading this movement wanted freedom at the forefront. And the reason why they wanted freedom at the forefront was because they themselves were either, mestizo or of African descent, or Black and Native in heritage. And so if you have individuals who had been enslaved or whose parents and grandparents had been born enslaved, and you were fighting for the freedom of your country, you wanted to ensure that you were free in that country, right? And so this is what was motivating this abolition, early abolition through the 18 teens up until 1821, when Mexico actually secured independence from Spain and they could, build this new nation. And so there's 2 laws that were implemented right after the securing of Mexican independence from Spain were also leading through this agendas of freedom, because these were people that had invested interest in making sure that freedom was on the table for all Mexicans. And so 1821 and 1822, these 2 laws that I have highlighted here, 1821 and 1822, I will read the first. For instance, the 1822 law stated from the very beginning that, and I'm quoting, I'm quoting and then translating it in English. All inhabitants of Mexico, without distinction of being Europeans or Africans or Indians or mestizos, are citizens with the freedom to pursue their lives according to their merits and virtues. And this is very telling before I go into the 1822 law, because you start hearing here the idea of citizenship. And if you consider the history of the United States, citizenship was not on the table for Black Americans, particularly not at this early point in 1821. And as we'll come to know, by 1857 with the Dred Scott case, citizenship was completely denied to Black Americans in the US. But in Mexico, citizenship was a possibility as early as 1821. And so the 1822 law, for instance, stated that no governmental document is to classify citizens by racial origin. And thus every person living on Mexican territory is henceforth to be considered without distinction a citizen, even on paper. And so this law is also very important to analyze and understand, because particularly when we consider the erasure of Blackness in Mexican spaces today, you know, we up until the 2020 census, we didn't have racial categories in Mexico. You know, everybody was Mexican and labeled Mexican. But this law that was implemented in 1822 was one of those that was passed for the purpose of abolishing that casta system that was in Mexico up until then, that categorized people by race. And so with this, having no distinction, just, you know, erased, you know, when you were born or you got married, you could not be, you know, instead of being like you're Black or mestizo or mulatto, it was like Mexican, Mexican, Mexican. And so while this was an intention to, an intended law to sort of fight against racial classification or racism, in this time, by the 20th century, it became a law that invisibilized Black Mexicans or Mexicans of African ancestry. So, you know, it's important to consider the intent, the original intent, and then what it actually became. But it's very important to know also that now today, since 2020, Mexicans can also categorize themselves as Black Mexicans, or officially in the census. And so I wanted to say that, but these laws were very telling. And throughout the 1820s, there were other laws that took shape that were presented and passed. And they were very important. For instance, the federal law of July 13th of 1824 was the law that prohibited the slave trade into Mexican territory, and also added that anyone who was smuggled into Mexican spaces would secure their freedom by the mere fact of setting foot on Mexican soil. And so keep this in mind as we continue, as I continue to tell you the stories that continue to happen, for instance, in spaces like Texas, where the Mexican government offered Anglo-Americans to come into Texas and settle, but with the caveat that, you know, Mexico was abolishing slavery. And so Anglo-Texans were arriving with enslaved people from across the US South. And so these contentions just brewed a lot of animosity, because through this process as was being brewed, as we see Mexico officially abolish slavery in 1829, you see Anglo slavers bring in enslaved people into Mexican territory during this same time period that Mexico was abolishing it. And so for us, when Mexico passed the abolition of slavery in 1829, they saw a revolt taking shape in Texas, because slaveholders did not want to free their slaves and did not want to let go of the institution of slavery. And so even though Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, they did give the Texas slaveholders an exception by December of 1829, saying, okay, we don't need a revolt, but we can offer you this extension or exemption to the abolition law, where you can keep your slaves for a period of 10 years, but don't rebel. That was basically the agreement. They did establish some limitations of like, okay, you can keep your slaves, so you cannot bring any more. And of course, that was not what happened. And as we all know, this was a sort of like a measure of appeasement, and appeasement didn't work, because rebellion still brewed. Rebellion still broke out by 1836, where Texas actually broke away from Mexico, or Texas slaveholders broke away from Mexico. And so this also prompted the last abolition law in Mexico that happened in 1837, when the Texas Revolution happened and slaveholders rebelled from Mexico and said, we are creating our own, the independent Republic of Texas. That was a slave country. Mexico said, you know what, Texas is still part of Mexico, but now we're going to abolished slavery fully with no exceptions, even for Texans. And as we all know, these contentions continued up until 1845, when Texas was finally annexed to the United States. And Mexico, up until the annexation, continued to say that Texas was still part of Mexico. So just keep that in mind. And so, another part of the story that I wanted to share with you that I do center in my work is regarding this process of abolition, is that it did not just materialize through its laws, but also through the actions of both Mexican abolitionists and Black abolitionists in the US. For instance, in 1833, the then Vice President of Mexico, Valentin Gomez Farias, wrote to Black abolitionists in Philadelphia, Samuel Webb, stating that, hey, if they, Black Americans, and I'm quoting here, would like to come to Mexico, we will offer them land for cultivation, plots for houses where they can establish towns, and tools for work under the obligation that they will, Black Americans, will obey the laws of the country and the authorities already established by the Supreme Court of the Federation. And so what you see on the screen is actually the initial inquiry that prompted this response by Gomez Farias, by the Vice President. This is a letter written by Samuel Webb, a Black abolitionist in the United States, to Mexico, where he basically was asking a series of questions. This is just basically a summary that gives you the letter in summarized form, but more clearly stated. But he asked several questions. Among these questions was like, okay, if we go to Mexico, if we make it there, would Black immigration to Mexico be well received by the government, but also by the Mexican people? Would people of color be able to be considered equal to those who are not people of color in Mexico? Because Black abolitionists understood that Mexico was a country where there were all hues, there were Black Mexicans, Native Mexicans. So he wanted to know what they would experience in Mexico as Black people settling. And he also asked, how long will it take for Black Americans to have the right to attain citizenship? Again, this idea of citizenship was very present and very important, particularly for Black people that were trying to make it to Mexico, because they consider, like, if they're Black Mexicans in Mexico have citizenship. And so these were very important questions they were asking. And another thing that he asked was, how can we make sure to obtain property, land, and how can we buy it? And so just this notion that Black abolitionists were in direct conversation with Mexican abolitionists is very important, because it's something that it has not been taught in history books in the US or in Mexico. And so, for instance, in 1832, in 33, the Mexican embassy was established in Philadelphia. And the first envoy of the Mexican embassy in Philadelphia was Castillo y Lanzas, a man called Castillo Lanzas, who was the leader of foreign affairs, let's call him that. And he made it to Philadelphia, and he was in attendance at every anti-slavery meeting that started in December of 1833. And every time he would go, he would write down his notes, and he will send them to Mexico with his thoughts and ideas of how Mexico should support Black abolitionists and the anti-slavery movement. He would also send pamphlets to Mexico saying that this was what was given out at the anti-slavery convention. These are the thoughts and the needs. And so the fact that there were these relationships being forged on the ground by abolitionists, Black and Mexican, is a very important aspect of this history that has often been obscured, but very needed to be known. And so this tells us more about what Mexican freedom may have looked like. For Black Americans, certainly those considering going to Mexico and to be free and to live away from the institution of slavery. And as these discussions and connections link Black abolitionists in the US and Mexican abolitionists in Mexico, animosity, just keep in mind that this animosity continued to brew in Texas about this abolition of slavery, these changes in the laws. And so that this led to the further passing of other laws to limit slavery in Mexico officially. So. And so before I move on from Mexico's abolition process, I also want to point out another law that was added to the Mexican Constitution of 1857. Article 2 of Title 1 of Section 1 was changed to declare that in the Republic of Mexico, everyone is born free. The slaves who set foot on national territory regain just by doing so their freedom and therefore have the right to the full protection of Mexican laws and Mexican citizenship. And this is very important to acknowledge again, because this is the same year that the Dred Scott case happened. And Mexico offered these protections and these securities when the US was denying them for Black Americans. And this law that or amended to the Mexican Constitution happened not just out of nowhere or necessarily because of the Dred Scott case, but because throughout the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, and throughout the 1850s actually, requests from local, state, and federal authorities from the US were being sent to Mexico, demanding for the extradition for extradition treaties to be signed for the return of formerly enslaved people that were in Mexico already free to be returned back to the US. In the United States, the slaveholders were losing a lot of money, or they were claiming that they were losing a lot of money, and they were very intent in either getting the people back who they considered their property, and very valuable property, even when these individuals were already free in Mexico. But since the 1820s, for instance, the United States consistently tried to coerce Mexico to sign some of these treaties. And for instance, Henry Clay was one of those that sent some requests to Mexico. In 1827, Clay urged and procured a stipulation with the Mexican government to restore runaway slaves. This request also called for reciprocity. Clay wrote that the US promised to return runaway slaves to Mexico, and in return, Mexico must do the same. Unsurprisingly, Mexico's anti-slavery stance was even then in the 1820s underestimated, perhaps as it has historically been. Even today, yet Mexico's anti-slavery stand poignantly clear. It was poignantly clear in the response that was sent back to Henry Clay by two Mexican abolitionists, Andres Quintana Roo and Jose Maria Tornel. Quintana Roo responded that not only there were no slaves belonging to Mexico on the frontiers adjacent to the United States that the US could restore back to Mexico, but that the country stood behind the belief that, and I'm quoting him, enslaved people have the unalienable right, which the author of nature has conceded to them, to procure their liberty, and that Mexico has the intent to erase, again, I'm quoting Quintana Roo, the slavery stain from the Mexican Republic, in order to preserve its institutions. So you start seeing clearly how Mexican officials were responding to this request for treaties to bring back people that were already free in Mexico. Clay's request was rejected, but not before being promptly and directly addressed, like you see Quintana Roo's response. Again, on May 21st of 1828, the Mexican Congress officially rejected another one, this time the one submitted by Joel Poinsett, including his strict request he was requesting for the devolution of fugitive slaves. Mexican abolitionists ardently stressed to Poinsett and Clay that it would, and I'm quoting, it would be most extraordinary that in a treaty between two free republics, slavery should be encouraged by obliging ours to deliver up fugitive slaves to their merciless and barbarous masters of North America. So here you start seeing like the ideals and the thoughts of Mexican abolitionists and Mexican people to this idea of slavery, to this idea of returning people that are free in Mexico back to enslavement. These diplomatic clashes between Mexico and the United States that arose because of the significant, these clashes arose because of the significant number of Black Americans who were reaching Mexican spaces to be free. So they were certainly thousands. And I have added this slide right here that you see. This is one of those requests. This was sent in 1833 by the state of Louisiana, requesting to make a treaty with Mexico for the amicable retrieval of runaway slaves. If you can conceive a treaty for the retrieval of runaway slaves to be amicable, right? And so in this letter, actually, it was sent to Mexico, and it says that this measure, this treaty request, this is what Louisiana was saying, has been provoked by the circumstances that have witnessed the desertion of slaves to Mexico to be increasingly frequent, and these desertions impede the recovery measures established before our authorities by our citizens of Louisiana, which prevent the prompt devolution of fugitive slaves to their owners. So Louisiana was saying, hey, you know, they're going to Mexico and we cannot get them back, and we cannot cross the border because it was not legal for US citizens to cross the border into Mexico to retrieve them, but they were still doing it, or sending slave hunters to illegally cross. And so they were saying, we're losing a lot of money, our slaveholders are losing a lot of money, we need to have a treaty. But Mexico profusely refused to do so, even in this early stage and all through the 1850s. So it's important to note that Mexico continued consistently in denying this sort of requests. And you can start seeing sort of the volume, the number of people that were moving to Mexico to be quite large, especially if they were losing large amounts of money. And I do have in my book numbers and that slaveholders were quoting to be losing, that was in the millions of dollars at that time. And so before, you know, and if you have any questions about this, just please put them in the, I will address them at the end of this. So now I want to pose another question that I started with in Greenville when I was in Greenville. This project really was born in Greenville at ECU when I was there. And I wanted to know who led the Underground Railroad to Mexico. Particularly, I wanted to know, you know, who was the Harriet Tubman that led people to Mexico. And this is what I have found. I have found that a diverse pool of individuals and groups did a lot of the helping. Mexican people were certainly known to help, as you see here, and I will talk a little bit about that, both within the US and Mexico. Sometimes Mexicans served as guides to cross the river. At other times, with local Mexicans offer food and raise money to give freedom fighters who arrived often with nothing but a few clothes. They would help them raise money for food, for supplies, for shoes, for them to continue on their journey south. As you see here, this community in Mexico, a little bit north of Monclova, raised 246 pesos to help people for food and shoes so that they can continue on their journeys. Also, Native people would do a lot of the helping, although it is important, you know, Native people would also offer them safe havens or safe passage. Sometimes they would trade and barter some of the supplies that enslaved people were taking with them. So these freedom fighters were taking horses, ammunition, guns, everything that they could take. They were preparing these journeys to make it to Mexico, and they would bring along supplies. And what they would use the supplies for, including the horses, is they would trade them with either Mexicans or Native Americans for safe passage, for harbor, for to be hidden if there were slave hunters behind them. And so you start seeing these communities of assistance materialize. Although that said, I want to make sure to address or to tell you that both Mexicans and Native communities were also often refusing assistance. And, you know, I do see in the records that Mexicans also were in the business of slave hunting, as well as Native people were in the business of slave hunting. Sometimes they would take them and return them to their enslavers. Sometimes they would re-enslave them themselves. There were, I found Mexicans that also helped them, prevented them from reaching the border and instead alerted slave hunters of their whereabouts. So very complex history, is very complicated, but overall, you do see these networks of assistance being forged and efficient at times. Others, as white abolitionists, as we all know from the United States, also assisted people to freedom in Mexican spaces. We have individuals such as Benjamin Lundy that did a lot of work in the US-Mexico borderlands. But again, as I stated in the beginning, importantly, it were Black Americans who were doing this fighting. They were very active in reaching Mexico. They were very active in their own mobility, in their own planning, in their own securities. Like they would reach Mexican spaces and they would go to the alcaldes and ask for securities and protections. And of course, a lot of them did not. A lot of them went undetected because of the nature of the clandestine nature of these movements. While there were many that did go and seek protection officially, others just passed through unnoticed and found jobs and livelihoods in Mexico in the very many ways that they could. And so a large part of the work that I do actually centers on Black women freedom fighters who reach Mexico or who help other people reach Mexican spaces. So as well as Black women who failed to make it to Mexican spaces, but whose fight were powerful and are important to be told. We have Sylvia and Rhoda, for instance. Sylvia arrived, this is Sylvia right here. Sylvia arrived in Mexican Texas in 1826, enslaved, but by 1834, she had secured her freedom. And her freedom papers, but not only secured her freedom, but the freedom of her 3 children. And then she became an individual who offered freedom to others seeking to reach Mexico. She established a ranch on the outskirts of present-day Austin, Texas. And from her ranch, she had a ferry. She had a certified ferry. And in her ferry, she would ferry people to freedom all the way from Austin, Texas, to the Gulf of Mexico and across into safety. And she lived in Austin. She didn't move herself to Mexico, but she was doing this labor. And so in many ways, I consider her to be a Harriet Tubman, someone that needs to be taught and understood as Harriet Tubman was understood, a person who fought for freedom and who helped others to freedom in Mexico. And by the 1850s, actually, because of rising tensions and racism, the laws of Texas became more inflexible, and actually some laws were passed where no free Black persons could live in the state of Texas, as well as no Mexicans could live in the state of Texas, because the idea that Mexicans were helping people to freedom or coercing people to freedom was very real for Texas lawmakers, and so they banned free Black persons and Mexicans from living in Texas because they thought that they were helping them to escape to freedom. And so Sylvia took her family out of Austin, moved to the Rio Grande, to the border, and there she established another ranch, and she continued taking people to freedom on her ferry that she also certified across on the Rio Grande. She actually didn't live in this Matagorda area, but it was a little bit, if you see the map, it's a little bit on this side, and in Hidalgo County, where it's very close to the Brownsville borderlands, if that gives you a point of reference. And Sylvia continued up until 1861, when the Civil War broke out. Her family was labeled Unionist by the Confederacy. The Confederacy were coming to get her, and so she took her family, moved across the border to Matamoros, and there she waited out the Civil War. By the 1870s, she returned to her ranch in the US, but a lot of her children, who were older by this time, remained in Mexico. And so they grew up there, they had children there. And a lot of that part of the family grew up knowing that they were Mexican. And today I actually was able to connect with their descendants. And most of them didn't even know about Sylvia or that experience. They just knew that they were Mexican. And now they're now looking into their Black roots and the roots in the US as well. So that is the beauty and relevance of the history that I'm presenting, because it's very relevant to today. The second woman that I put here is Rhoda. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very interested in highlighting people, freedom fighters, those who reached Mexico and were able to succeed, but also those who didn't, because their experiences are equally foundational to our stories, to our shared histories. And so Rhoda ran away. She was enslaved in Missouri, and she was the locality or the geography where she was enslaved was about 950 miles to Canada and about 950 miles to Mexico. And why she decided to go to Mexico, I still don't know her personal reason, but she didn't go to Canada. She went south. And this was in the 1850s. She decided to go south. 1855, right here, as you see, she almost made it to the Mexican border. The only problem that she had was that right before she found, the Piedras Negras road, like the road to Piedras Negras, she stopped and asked for directions to the road to Piedras Negras because she knew that there was a crossing on Piedras Negras that she could cross into Mexico to what is now Juarez. But the person that she asked was certainly pro-slavery, and so she alerted the slave hunters that had been pursuing Rhoda, and Rhoda was caught and taken to San Antonio. She was put in jail to await her enslaver to come and pick her up. And then she found out like she was actually pregnant, and almost 9 months pregnant. She delivered her child in the San Antonio jail. But so you start seeing a lot of women trying to make it to Mexico with their children and trying to make it to freedom, to give their children a better life, which is not unlike the stories that we hear of people crossing the border today, why they were coming, bringing their children and crossing, when less than 200 years ago, the stories were switched. People were trying to cross into Mexican spaces. And to conclude, because time is of the essence, I wanted to close with one more woman that a fascinating story of freedom fighting and resistance, and that I think that will neatly tie the stories together. I initially found, her name is Matilde Hens. I initially found her in Matamoros, in the archive in Matamoros, but then later I found her in the archive in El Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City. And then I found her in a Texas register of her slaveholder had moved to Texas, and he had claimed her as runaways. So Matilda was a woman who was enslaved, likely born enslaved in the US, but by the time she was in her 20s, she was enslaved in Louisiana. She ran away from Louisiana, escaped her enslaver, and then she reappears in Reynosa, Mexico, Reynosa, Tamaulipas. There she was living free, she had a job, she had a house, so she had everything she needed, she was living free. Her enslaver, however, pursued her and did not stop. He hired a Texas slave hunter and a Mexican slave hunter to go find her whereabouts. And surely enough, they found her in the ranch. She was working for a family who owned the ranch in Reynosa, Don Manuel Luis del Fierro. And so she was living there, and one August afternoon, the slaveholder with the slave hunters break into the ranch, break into her house, and try to kidnap her in the middle of the night and take her back to US slavery, and take her daughter back to US slavery. Her daughter was an infant girl named Harriet. And so this is where I see the freedom fighting materialize. Matilda fought with all that she had. She fought him with her bare hands. She started screaming. She started calling for help. And all the neighbors, the Mexican neighbors, woke up. They came to her help. Her employer actually came with a gun. And that's why, she was able to stop the slave hunter from taking her former enslaver from taking her. And instead, she and Don Manuel Luis del Fierro took the former enslaver to the local jail. And this is why we have her testimony, because she gave this is a 20-page testimony of, she tells the alcalde exactly what happened, how she made it to Mexico, what she was doing, that she broke into, and that she was fighting him. And so you start seeing the fight actually materialize, the fight to be free, to remain free. And up until this point, when I found these two records, I knew about the daughter, but I didn't know anything else. But one of the records that I found later did tell me that one of the slave hunters had actually taken Harriet and rode on a horse to the border, but the Mexicans in the next town stopped him and took Harriet back to her mother. And so it's a phenomenal story of freedom fighting, and not just freedom to reach the Mexican space or to move, but also the freedom to, the fighting to continue. They had to continue fighting to prevent from being kidnapped. They had to continue fighting for everything that they had, for protections, for securities. And so I wanted to end with her story to offer you this visual and this story of resilience and resistance and freedom fighting. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation. It's just bits and pieces of the work that I'm doing. And of course, I cannot give it all, but I hope that this was informational to you. And if you have any questions, I'm here for them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I don't even know how to respond. I'm going to get my thoughts together because there are so many questions. I really appreciate your use of narratives to these stories, because it humanizes the history and gives us just a greater understanding, I believe, of what actually occurs. These were people. And I'm going to stop. I'm going to go to the chat now and see what questions we might have. If you don't, I don't see one yet. Let me go back.
We had one.
Okay, here we are. Yeah. Okay, I do see. Okay. So this is from Karen. Dr. Hammack, how were Mexicans responding to the threat of Comanche raids in Mexican towns that included the kidnapping of women and children and selling them into slavery in the U.S. southern states?
Thank you for that question. Dr. Siv, she was one of my professors at ECU, so thank you for being here. That is actually a phenomenal story that puts into context the very complex histories that were ongoing during the same time that Mexico was offering freedom for individuals such as Matilda and others, and how they were able to claim freedom and protections at the same time where others weren't so lucky, like Native people across these borderlands regularly also faced enslavement and being sold back. And so that is an aspect of the work that I'm still integrating into the book, and to better understand the Native role in these histories, or the Native presence in these histories. Because while I do see, the histories of where the Comanches were being enslaved, or not necessarily protected by the Mexican government, but at times also said, oh, you're still part of this Mexican nation, which Mexico kept trying to claim that the Comanches and the Apaches were also part of the Mexican nation. There were other Native people that were acting as, in this borderlands, or adapting and adopting chattel slavery. And for instance, I have a story that doesn't necessarily perhaps answer the question about these Native roles, but this man named Peter and her son John escaped a Native household in Oklahoma where they were being enslaved, and made it to Mexico. And they actually the Native family hired slave hunters to go retrieve them, and they were successful. They retrieved them and brought them back, but they escaped the second time. And instead of moving into Mexico without any protections, or without telling anybody, they decided the second time they reached Mexico, they decided to go to the alcalde and tell their story and say, hey, this is the second time we broke away, and we want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We want to know what Mexico is going to do for us to remain in Mexico free, for us to not be kidnapped as well. And also, we want Mexico to help us bring my wife and the rest of my family who's still enslaved by Native communities. And I think they were actually Cherokee, the Native communities that were enslaving them. And so there's a lot of Native actors at play in these histories that, you know, really truly make it very complex and complicated to explain without saying, you know, Mexico had this banner of freedom, but that freedom materialized in very many different ways for very many different people, particularly Native and Black. And so we also, you know, I also have to put into context Black Mexicans that already lived in Mexico from the colonial era that had been enslaved. And so this is also an aspect of the story that I'm still incorporating to my book. And I don't know if that answers the question, but let me know and we can continue this conversation. But it's certainly very important histories that we need to better understand and better learn and teach. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hammack. I have the next question for you. And this is from Francisco, and he says, would you happen to know if any systems of language developed between African American and Mexican individuals escaping slavery?
Yes, actually, thank you for that question, Francisco. It's very interesting that you asked that, because there is this idea that, and this is a question that I ask a lot, how did runaway slaves understand Spanish? How did they fare? It was easier for them to go to Canada because they spoke English. But you know, what I have found in the records that I have mined in the US and in Mexico, particularly, for instance, the large body of records, runaway slave ads. Time and again, you see runaway slave advertisements claiming that, and this runaway slave can speak English, Spanish, and French, right? And so I keep coming across all this, and I was like, they were definitely speaking English, they were definitely speaking Spanish and French. And so they were certainly able to communicate and forge. The language barrier wasn't a problem in this space, particularly, like, let's say they may not have known Spanish, perhaps, but there was this network of information that were crossing this vast frontier. And a book that really helped me understand these networks of information is Alejandra Dubkowski's Informed Power, that really centers Native power systems and networks. And the way that I've seen the records pertaining to Black Americans reaching Mexico, these networks of information and power really did apply to the Black communities and to the Mexican communities that were living adjacent to these plantations. And they were able to communicate and forge alliances. I have found many records where individuals were understanding there were camps across this borderlands, the Louisiana, the Texas borderlands, where these camps were made by Mexicans, and what the records in the states would say, Mexicans and runaways were colluding and planning in these camps in the middle of nowhere, in the outskirts of towns, these illegal camps, right? And so these connections through language that they certainly communicated, they certainly forged these networks, became very threatening for US authorities, because they understood that if they understood each other, and they certainly did, they were helping them run away. And that is one of the reasons why states like Texas and Louisiana, well, Texas principally, banned Mexicans from living in Texas or living in the vicinity of where Black people were enslaved, because they knew that they understood each other and they could help them escape. I'm not sure if that's what the question that you asked, but in another aspect, which I don't talk about here, but I talk in my book about the Black Seminoles or the Muskogee people that reached Mexico, for instance, the area of Coahuila. These individuals had been enslaved in Florida. These were descendants of Muskogee, of Gula, heritage people. And when they reach Mexico, which their communities are still there today, in El Nacimiento de los Negros principally, but there's also other communities in Parras. And so because I've actually gone to some of their festivals, their songs that they sing in their festivals have Gula words. They still have that Gula intonations and words. They still cook with their gula recipes. And so there's this language that continues to appear from their ancestors, and they have continued to preserve and pass on to their children. And so I hope that gives you also another aspect of the language, the importance of language and the preservation of some of those cultural language histories. Thank you.
I have the next question from Catherine. Were the natives and Mexicans that cooperated with the American slave hunters ever held accountable in Mexico? Did they face punishment for going against the abolition laws?
Thank you so much. Yes, that is definitely a yes. Well, not all of them actually, because it was certainly hard, as well as slave hunters in Texas, as you know, slave hunters in the US. A lot of the times when unpunished, some of the slave hunters were Texas Rangers who later became Texas heroes. Actually, today, a lot of the Texas Rangers are considered Texas heroes, and their whole history of slave hunting has been erased. But beyond that, Mexican slave hunters, I have found one occasion where a Mexican slave hunter was held accountable. And actually, it was the slave hunter that, well, actually, it wasn't the one that took Matilda, but there was this Black woman from Brownsville called Morel. And Morel witnessed the kidnapping. A group of slave hunters kidnapped a family of 4. And she crossed the border. She was a free Black woman, crossed the border into Reynosa, went to the alcalde and said, hey, last night I saw these slave hunters taking this family, and I want you to investigate. And so this is another aspect of a freedom fighter, right? She was pushing the Mexican government to be accountable for what, they were offering freedom. So she was like, oh, you're offering, so now do something about it. And so she forced them to investigate. And when they found they actually found Ana, the wife of the family, like the mother and the wife of the family that was enslaved. She was the one that was kidnapped, that had been kidnapped back to the US. They found her, and she had actually escaped from the enslaver again, but she was in a safe house in Brownsville. And so the Mexican authority, the official, went to Brownsville to interview her and see, I guess, how he could help her. And in her interview, she said exactly who were the men who kidnapped her. And she names one of the Mexican men, Manuel Munoz. And this is the one that was actually did face charges. Then he goes down and he starts asking other witnesses, this official. And a lot of the witnesses point out that, yes, Manuel Munoz was a slave hunter that had actually been paid in cash right after he helped them cross them. And actually, the woman, Ana, tells him, yeah, I saw him receive money when we were on this side of the border, once they had been smuggled back. And he did face charges, and he did face jail. Now, I'm not really sure how long he stayed in jail, but there were instances where the Mexican authorities did pull through, investigate, and did commit to jail those Mexican slave hunters. Now, how often that happened, I still don't know. The reason why I know this case is because of that record that I found in Mexico about Morel, this Black woman that came down and said, you need to investigate. So again, you start seeing how Black Americans were doing this work, doing this labor, crossing into Mexico and fighting for the freedom, not for her because she was free, but for the family that had been kidnapped and brought back to US slavery.
Thank you so much. Catherine says she appreciates your thorough answer. And I think we're probably at about the end of our time. I did just have one question. Do you have a surname for Sylvia?
Hector.
Hector.
Her last name was Hector.
Okay, all right. Okay, I wanted to know that. I'm a family genealogist, and I've had my DNA done. I have several Mexican cousin matches, so I want to see if she's
Sylvia Hector. And actually, she married a white man on the borderlands, Weber, John Weber. So you could also find her. Sometimes she's referred in the records, particularly on the Texas ranch, as Sylvia Weber, but her maiden name was Hector.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rook, who will have some final remarks. This was absolutely wonderful. We look forward to having you back again.
No, thank
But
you. I appreciate it.
I'm so thankful for this homecoming. I also want to mention, I believe Ms. Sharon Bryant put some information in the chat about Dr. Hammack serving as a panel guest for the Underground Railroad panel to be held in New Bern at Tryon Palace on May 21st from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And she says to please register by calling 252-639-3524. So we thank you, Ms. Bryant, for letting all of us know about Dr. Hammack's next homecoming. And we are just so thrilled to have had you with us today to help us learn. And for many of us, the first time learning, hearing about these hidden histories. And we are so thankful that your research began here in Greenville, those seeds of knowledge of just trying to find out who was the Harriet Tubman who led Black folks to freedom in Mexico. We are so proud of you, and we thank you for extending all of your generosity of knowledge to us today. You have any final words for us before we sign off today?
No, I want to say thank you to everyone who attended. I appreciate the support, and I'm just so thankful to be here. Not in person, but I love Greenville. As you know, I'm an ECU alumni, and I do see my ECU people like Dr. Karen said being here. And also Dr. Ms. Bryant, I can't wait to meet you at the Underground Railroad panel. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you again, and everyone have an enjoyable day. Thank you so much for joining us. You all take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.